Here we go again. Another Crash Out Chronicles with a great guest, a great story here, which is really fascinating. Talking to Patrick Winn over in Asia, in Thailand, about his book, Narcotopia, in search of the Asian drug cartel that survived the CIA. So, I mean, this is a crazy subject. I mean, real fascinating. And Patrick, I've known Patrick for a good number of years. Back when we worked together at a place called Global Post, which is a media organization. And Patrick is many ways very similar to what I do in Mexico. He does in Asia, in Thailand. A lot of fascinating stuff. So yeah, good to see you, Patrick. How's it's morning over there in Bangkok, yeah?
Yeah, 8 in the morning. I'm just so happy to see you, Ioan. This is gonna be cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So the essence is this is getting into this micro state, war state, the correct pronunciation, war state, which is basically maybe the purest kind of narco state in the world. I mean, people accuse Mexico of being a narco state, or like Colombia back in the day, or Honduras, but this is kind of a kind of microstate run by a drug cartel that also has a history of CIA, Vietnam, all of this kind of crazy stuff. It's inside Burma. So to start off, I mean, it's such a great topic with all these tangents. You get into China and Chinese politics as well. So first of all, uh, tell us, what is War State? How big is it? Where is it?
Yeah, and first, Ioan, like I have to confess a bit of envy about what you do because you guys in Mexico, you narco periodistas, if I pronounce that correctly, um, the entire world knows about the realm that you cover, about the
Yeah,
narco world on the US-Mexico border. There's a million films, some amazing, some terrible.
yeah,
There's Netflix series. It's a well-established place. And over here in Asia, I'm trying to do the same thing. And it feels like I'm screaming for attention when in fact the drug trade here in Southeast Asia is huge. I mean, the meth trade alone is valued at $70 billion.
wow,
And you have all of the DEA intrigues, the CIA intrigues as well. And the war on drugs happens over here too. So I'm pleased to talk about it with your audience. Wa State. So I've lived in Bangkok for 16 years. I've been obsessed with Wa State for about 10 of those years. It's one of the most difficult places to access, I'd say, in the world. Much harder to get into than North Korea. It is this veritable nation state that exists inside the borders of Burma, or also called Myanmar. So if you look on the map, you see Myanmar, and it looks like it's one solitary unified country. It's not. You go into the mountains and you've gone to a place that is not Myanmar. It is not controlled whatsoever by the military regime of Myanmar. This place in particular, Wa State, is, I mean, you said microstate, pretty big. It's actually the size of Belgium. I know Belgium's not a very large country, but for a sort of a rogue narco nation, that's pretty big size, right? And they legitimately control all of it. Who is they? They is the United Wa State Army. So it's sort of a military style of leadership. It's a militarized state. This is a state with highways, cell phone towers, hydroelectric power. It has its own flag. It has its own national anthem, tax collection, ministries of health. I could go on and on and on. It's a very high functioning government, and it's sort of stuck between China and Thailand. So people look at the map, they'll see Myanmar, there's a mountain range here. Here's China, here's Thailand. Wa State, much of it is in between. And its primary, well, its economy is driven primarily by methamphetamine, production of methamphetamine. Um, Formerly, the United Wa State Army produced in-house. In more recent years, they've switched to a different model where they allow outside syndicates to come in and use their territory to build and run meth labs, and they take a cut. It's a more sophisticated way of being a cartel. And the volume of methamphetamine produced in Myanmar and in Wa State is just jaw-dropping. I mean, you will see seizures in Southeast Asia in 1 year of 1 billion methamphetamine pills. And I should explain that there's 2 products they're producing here. One is crystal meth. I don't need to explain what that is to your audience. Here in Southeast Asia, there's another product called yaba. It's a little pink pill. It's about the size of like a baby aspirin. It's scented like vanilla, so it smells kind of like vanilla cake frosting. It contains about 20% methamphetamine, and it's padded out with caffeine and other things. You can swallow it. You can sort of smoke it off a strip of foil, and you get high. It's speed, basically. This is for the working class peoples of Southeast Asia, the go-to drug. And, you know, we're talking about billions of these pills churned out a year. I mean, if the cops, you know this, if the cops are catching 1 billion, how many are they making? One old DEA adage is that, you know, governments tend to catch maybe 10 to 20% of what's produced. So do the math. I don't know how many pills are produced. I don't think anybody does, but we're talking at least 5 to 6 billion a year. And Wa State is a place where many of these pills are produced, and it finances, I really want to drive this home, it finances what is essentially a nation state. So the primary goal of Wa State, it isn't the same goal that you would have of, say, like an El Mayo in Mexico, where I think the primary goal is to make a lot of money. It's a corporation. Here, that money, of course, is making a few key figures rich, but it's also financing all the things you need to run a government and an army. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. No, this is so fascinating because it's such a important investigation. It's such a big story. What's amazing is I'd never heard of this place. I mean, not saying I should know everything, but like how many people have never heard of a place. I mean, some, we spend years covering drugs and crime, and there's this kind of crazy narco state there. The way you're talking is very descriptive, and I really recommend people to pick up the book. I mean, you've got a great writing style, a great straight writing style to explain this. A good read, very good read. So, Patrick is we're gonna get into later. We'll say that actually what it's like getting in to the Wa State, and this is kind of crazy through the doors, real adventure here. But getting to some background, I mean, there's so many questions here, but like, let's start off a bit historically. So we go back, let's go back a bit to post-World War II, up to the formation of the kind of what we became known as the Golden Triangle, because Wa State is part of that. So how did this whole, why did this become such a key drug producing and drug trafficking area, and how does it relate to Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and other parts of this Golden Triangle?
Yeah, Golden Triangle is a euphemism for this drug producing area. It's mostly in Burma, but sort of bleeds into Thailand, Laos as well. The reason for its infamy is this particular part of the world is excellent for growing the opium poppy. In fact, in places like, what is now Wa State, but was then the Wa hinterlands, the Wa peaks. Wa refers to an ethnic group, so I should be clear about that. There's an ethnic group called the Wa people who have lived there since time immemorial. And if you say to a Southeast Asian who's familiar with the Wa, well, the first thing they'll bring up is drug trafficking, unfortunately. The second thing they'll probably bring up is headhunting. So even in the post-World War II era, the Wa people had these sort of fortress-like villages way deep in the mountains. They're growing poppies over here. And in their fortresses, they have this sort of constellation society of little fortresses here and there. and they practice headhunting, which is cutting the heads off your rivals and putting them on a stick to display. And as I point out in the book, French revolutionaries cut people's heads off too. So did Japanese samurai. This is not unique to this ethnic group, but they did that primarily to keep people out. So at that time, the society was organized around producing opium poppies and selling them to select visitors who would come in, but largely trying to keep people out. So that's what was happening in the Wa corner of the Golden Triangle. Golden Triangle, writ large, is just an area in the mountains of Burma where the opium poppy grows vociferously. So,
okay, so you're 10 minutes into this interview, which means you are really interested in this crazy world of drugs and crime and psychedelics and gorillas and paramilitaries and all of this stuff. So please go to www.crashoutmedia.com and you can find all kinds of stories, podcasts, analysis, reportage, news and history about this. You can subscribe for free, or if you want to support my work, then just for $5 a month, the price of a cup of cappuccino, then you get all kinds of benefits and part of the Crash Out community. Now back to the interview.
What happened was China's over here. Here's the mountains of Burma, and China had a civil war. Okay, we know who won, the communists, right? The people who didn't win, I'm just going to give a real potted history. Some of the people who didn't win fled into Burma, which is next door. Most of them fled to Taiwan, but some were so far from the coast of China to Taiwan that they fled into Burma instead. And there was a group of numbering in the thousands, sort of cowboy types on horseback, who wanted to go back into China and try to retake it, or at least part of it, from Mao Zedong. The CIA came in and gave them weapons so that they could go back into China and do that. It failed miserably. Long story short, they then transitioned into more of a corporation. They, in an industrial style, created the Golden Triangle as we know it today. So there's all these poppies around. They coerced mostly the local peasants to grow as many poppies as possible, produce a lot of opium, and then traffic heroin mostly around the region of Southeast Asia. But that's how the Golden Triangle got started. It was the CIA project that sort of went sideways. And then the cowboys with all of these guns decide to traffic opium and heroin instead of going back into China to retake it. So that's the first major industrial production of opium and heroin coming out of the Golden Triangle. It was this group. How are our friends the Wa faring at this point? Well, you can't coerce the Wa to do anything. They, are from a pretty warrior-like society. And so at the time, they were simply supplying opium to this organization, but they weren't being they didn't have a boot on their heads or anything like that. Some of the other peasantry in the mountains of Burma were more or less coerced or sort of given a pittance for producing opium. You need like a large army of peasants to produce this stuff. And then the aforementioned CIA-linked organization was producing heroin, selling it to the highest bidder. A lot of it washed into what was then South Vietnam. So on the streets of Saigon during the Vietnam War, when you had GIs looking to buy heroin, a lot of it would have come from the Golden Triangle. So that's sort of the origin story of the Golden Triangle. Later, of course, yeah.
Quick question, sorry to jump in. You also have the Hmong people. Is that correct pronunciation? Hmong or Hmong?
Hmong, yeah.
In Laos. I don't know if they also spill into Burma and Thailand. And they were a lot of them were a big CIA-backed army to kind of combat the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese army coming into Laos. How do they fit into this scheme? I mean, these are just a whole bunch of different tribes of different peoples producing opium and kind of working together as a kind of network? Or how does that work? What is there a relationship between the Hmong and the Wa?
No, not exactly, but it's a similar phenomenon. Essentially, the CIA would do anything and everything to fight communism. That was their number one priority. And as Vietnam was heating up and going communist, or was well entrenched in communism at that point, and they wanted to stop its spread, they looked into the mountains of Laos and they looked into the mountains of Burma, and they were ready to, anyone who was willing to fight against communism or simply to gather intelligence on communist movements in Laos or in Vietnam, they would support. You got to fund these things. You got to fund these things. And a lot of these groups were already farming opium already. I mean, that was part of their traditional trade. So the opium helped finance some of these military misadventures. We should remind ourselves that in Laos, especially, this was not an openly declared war. It was a secret war. The American public was not clued into the fact that there were these, indigenous groups who were being set up, armed by the CIA to fight, the creeping spread of communism. So I don't think that the CIA was thrilled with the fact that these groups also produced opium. I don't think they were thrilled with the fact that later on, even on CIA planes, some of this opium was moving around because these people didn't have their own air freight wing, right? They needed logistical support, and the CIA provided it. It was just a means to an end. Okay, so they're also opium traffickers. Okay, so this opium traffic does help support the war effort financially. Well, we can tolerate that because communism is the number one evil that we're out to destroy. Not to jump ahead, but as the DEA comes along, as the Cold War is winding down in the 70s, the DEA has an entirely different attitude. For the DEA, if you're trafficking drugs, you're a bad guy. Bad guys have to go to jail. And so you start to see this clash in the region between the CIA and the DEA, with the CIA looking down on the DEA as just a bunch of cops who don't see the bigger picture. There's, stories in my book of DEA agents about to close in on some of the groups that are supported by the CIA, that are gathering intelligence for the CIA in these wild and woolly poppy lands. And, you get a tap on the shoulder. It's like, you're done. You're not going to lock anyone up from this group because you don't know the bigger picture. You don't know that these people are used to fight the number one evil in the world, which is communism. So you have that very testy dynamic there.
Right. So, say that obviously drugs provide a mechanism that you can fund client armies. You can find proxy wars and proxy armies. I mean, in Laos they had something like 10, 20 CIA advisors, and then an army of proxy army of whatever it was, 10,000, 20,000 Hmong people, and it's funded by opium. So it provides that. So as we see it in these various spheres. So okay, so we get through, and it funds. They're sending smack to Vietnam and to South Vietnam and the military, which, as you point out in your book, is really what starts the war on drugs. Is it's people coming back hooked on heroin from Vietnam, and then seeing that, and then Nixon then turns that and saying, "I'm going to have a war on drugs." So what happens then between the kind of, particularly to your story of war state, between the end of Vietnam, and then so the kind of the reason or the motive to support drug traffickers to fight communists starts to go down, and the DEA starts to build up, and more modern times? What's the kind of series of events that happens that they consolidate their own state there?
Yeah, the organization, the anti-communist Chinese organization that was dominating the show for much of the Cold War, in part because they had the support of the CIA, and the CIA was swatting the DEA away from arresting these guys. They start to lose steam, I would say, in the 80s, really. And at this point, Nixon had already gone to China, right? And the U.S. and China had a different relationship. And some of that really kooky Cold War CIA stuff was starting to dial back, where you put like a radio transponder on an opium smuggler's back and send him to the border of China or even over the border of China. So some of that stuff was getting dialed back. This group wasn't as useful anymore. They had a massive turf war with a new guy on the scene circa late 70s, 80s, and through the 80s, who's very infamous, probably the most infamous drug trafficker in Asia ever. That would be Khun Sa. Khun Sa came along and said, people argue about how sincere he was, but he said, we should use this treasure at our feet, this opium, to form a nation. And he specifically wanted to form a nation to protect the main indigenous group in Burma, which is the Shan people in that part of the mountains. And he said, if the American Revolution was just, then so is our revolution. We can tap this resource, opium, and of course heroin, to fund our own nation. He's the first guy in this region that really flies with that idea in a major way. It kind of works. I mean, the DEA isn't happy to hear this, but for a good stretch, he had a little micronation going right on the border of Thailand and Burma, like the Wa would later establish.
Okay, so the Shan people, this is different from they're a different language group because I heard about Shan state. So Shan and Wa, then they're two different. They're quite close and they're both into drugs, but they're totally different peoples.
Yeah, this is sort of a crude boiling it down type of thing. The Shan are more like valley people, and the Wa live on top of the mountains.
Okay.
There's a lot more Shan than there are Wa. And the Shan are Buddhist. They're really ethnic cousins to Thai people. So, I speak Thai. If I'm listening to someone speaking Shan, it feels like I'm just about to understand what they're saying. It's sort of probably like a Spanish Portuguese thing.
Yeah.
There's almost. All right. So, he's the first one to create a narco nation in the wilds of Burma. He was pretty successful at doing so. I mean, again, he's got his own hospitals, he's got his own schools, he's got his own flag. He is a head of state, essentially. He was also a big loudmouth, and he loved attention. He was inviting American TV reporters to come interview him in his not his lair, but his headquarters, and he saw himself as someone who could really reach out to a US president and make a deal. So he reached out to Carter, Reagan, the first George Bush, and said, look, let's cut the BS. You guys are dirty too. We all know the deal. Why don't you I'll produce all this opium. If you don't want it coming to America, just pay me to burn it, or I'll give it to you and you can burn it. Let's do something rational here, because your war on drugs is a joke. He's so cocky that he would talk to US presidents. I'm paraphrasing, of course, in more or less this way. Didn't earn him any fans with the DEA and nor the CIA, and they sought to get rid of him. And at one point in the early 90s, the CIA is ready to assassinate Khun Sa, and it was right around the time that George H.W. Bush was leaving office and Bill Clinton was coming in. Bill Clinton nixed it. He said, no, you can't do that. And I had a former CIA officer tell me, just if Bush had won, we would have got to, pop Khun Sa. So Khun Sa comes along and he's created this nation. The Wa eventually become more powerful when Khun Sa is weakened both by the DEA and other factors. They come in and take all of his territory. They hold it today. If I had a map behind me, I'd show you right on the border of Thailand as you're going into Burma. That's not Burma. That's not Myanmar. That's Wa state, even though it doesn't say it on the map. They take over his territory and they continue to take this idea. Yes, we're going to use narcotics to sustain a nation of our own to protect our ethnic people, which in this case is the Wa, and that's how it stands today.
Are they also involved in fentanyl?
Thank God, no. And this is really interesting. There's a link here that is poorly explored. What's the root source for the chemicals that make fentanyl? It's China. I mean, as I understand it, these are chemicals that are siphoned off from China's huge pharmaceutical industry. I mean, around the world, when we're taking pills or medicine or whatever, a lot of it is produced originally in China and India, but a lot in China. So the chemicals to make fentanyl originate in China in these factories. Okay, so the Southeast Asian market, it actually isn't all that interested in opioids at all. It's become disinterested in heroin. The Wa have torched all of their poppy fields, so they're not really involved in heroin anymore. It's all meth, meth, meth. Well, that same giant Chinese pharmaceutical industry is a place where chemicals are produced that are siphoned off to make methamphetamine. They're just very different chemicals than would be used to make fentanyl. So as chemicals are flowing this way, perhaps to the coast of Mexico, they're also flowing this way into Wa State, different chemicals, mainly pseudoephedrine. And increasingly, chemists who are resident in Wa State are making precursors. So they make, I forget the name of the chemical, but there's a chemical that's fairly easy to require and not very regulated that can be used to make pseudoephedrine. Pseudoephedrine is the key ingredient in methamphetamine. So if you want to make a kilo of crystal meth that's highly pure, you need the equivalent of 10 kilos of pseudoephedrine. And so that's the link. One set of chemicals is flowing this way, another set of chemicals is flowing this way. If they were ever to get involved in fentanyl, it would be a massive, massive, massive problem, because the Wa are much harder to dislodge than any of the cartels we see in Mexico. The Wa have 30,000 troops, uniformed troops. They have anti-aircraft weapons. They have armed drones. They have armored personnel carriers. I could go on and on and on. They run a fairly sophisticated army. You can see it in the title of their organization. It's the United Wa State Army. All of these, this armament is coming, they're cast-offs from the People's Liberation Army of China. So through the back door, China is arming the Wa. Now, you may ask, why the hell would Beijing want to arm a drug cartel on its border? Well, it's actually been a pretty effective strategy. They treat the Wa like a client state. And so because Beijing supplies not only weapons, but concrete, oil, everything you need to run a state, they can put the screws to the Wa and be like, do this, don't do this. One thing they say is, all your methamphetamine, it is not washing back into China. You are in big trouble if your meth goes into China. So instead, it dumps into Southeast Asia instead. And, maybe I'll stop there, but I hope, perhaps, that if the Wa were to begin to be involved in fentanyl, you would have to hope and pray that Beijing would say, quit doing that, because otherwise the DEA is not going to go against a 30,000 troop army that is deeply lodged in the mountains of Burma. It's not going to happen.
Or it gets, it gets into a lot of crazy possibilities there. So the meth they're selling is, so it goes to not really go to the United States or Europe. It's supplying the Asian meth market. Now, I've been to the Philippines. It's a bit of a crazy story, but I've been to the Philippines, and there was a lot of people taking meth there. Is that similar levels in many parts of Asia, that level of meth use? Or how big is it? And and describe what it's like there.
We can just look at seizures and get an idea of the consumption. So if the cops in Southeast Asia, police are seizing 1 billion meth pills per year, that means a lot more are being sold and consumed. It is the go-to drug in this part of the world. I could go outside here in the streets of Bangkok and I could find meth fairly easily. If someone said, "Hey, go find a gram of heroin," or else, I don't think I could. It would take a while. I mean, meth dominates the scene here. Meth, and to a lesser degree, ketamine is starting to bubble up. So yeah, the stuff you saw in the Philippines, they call it shabu there. Here in Thailand, they call it ice. And smoke it out of a bowl. That's actually the drug that more of a middle to upper class person would be using. I know it sounds a little bit strange. If you can afford a gram or two of crystal meth, that's going to run you $100 to $200. It's kind of a lot of money in this part of the world. Something a middle class person can afford. Something a hardworking taxi driver can afford. If someone's in poverty, they can't come up with $100. They're going to have to buy one of those little pink meth pills for the equivalent of, say, $3 to $5.
Okay. So meth here is the cocaine, and yabe is the crack, as maybe as you could say. Okay, so we get they've got a whole state. I mean, this is so incredible. The Myanmar government, it can't handle them. It can't deal with them. It can't just knock them out. They're too powerful.
No, not gonna happen. Not they wouldn't even try. Wouldn't
Yeah.
even try. The Burmese military, the Myanmar military right now are just getting their asses handed to them by all these other much weaker revolutionary groups. I mean, I don't know that the Myanmar military government as we know it is going to exist in 6 months to a year. So the idea of taking on the biggest, baddest group, which remember has a relationship with China, with Beijing, forget about it. They're not gonna touch them. For this reason, the WA state has existed for 35 years. No one has really challenged it since then. I mean, it's fairly stable. It is the most stable government inside the borders of Myanmar, which I know sounds crazy. I think it's going to be there for 50 to 100 years after this. So they're not going anywhere.
I want to get in a second into some of your adventures in the WA state, but just following up on a point you made there, which is very interesting. So China um, decides to work with this drug cartel, drug narco state, and then use them to say, you don't sell your crystal meth to us, but you can sell it elsewhere. I mean, I guess kind of two questions on this. One is, what's China's real thinking here in having a client narco state, and did it learn this from the Americans? Is it copying the American tactics here?
If so, it's operating on a more sophisticated level than the U.S. And look, the China-Burma border and the U.S.-Mexico border are really apples and oranges, so they don't fully compare. But look, there's going to be narco activity in the mountains of Burma, in the mountains of Myanmar, no matter what, okay? The Golden Triangle is up and running, somebody's going to be doing it's a semi-lawless area, it's going to happen. So China's strategy has been to manage it. So it prefers to have one big giant whale of a narco state on its border that's stable, as opposed to a bunch of like piranhas chewing each other's faces off, which at some point seems to be what I see from afar happening on the US-Mexico border. So the DEA will proactively try to lock cartel leaders up. It will try, I mean, its ultimate goal, I suppose, would be to dismantle cartels completely. And so it tries to do that with minimal effectiveness, but it tries. From what I gather, and you're the expert on this here, that creates these power vacuums, right? And then you have smaller or lesser players rushing in to fill them, even within an organization. So if you knock off somebody on the top or number 2 or number 3, then you have people rushing in. This creates instability. This creates violence. In China, in WA state, you don't have that. It's very stable. What is it? Hundreds of thousands of internecine narco-related deaths in Mexico. You hear about it a little bit in Myanmar. Usually when someone's coming over a border, like say from Myanmar into Thailand to bring meth, and armed forces shoot them up, I don't hear much about it. It's not a big story, which is pretty astounding. It's very managed by China. Now, I don't want anyone to think I'm suggesting that the DEA or any other US organization like go in and try to co-opt the cartels and do the same thing in Mexico. I don't think that makes much sense. The difference is WA state, it has what it would call a noble cause, okay? Upholding a stable state for the indigenous people who are called the WA. That's what it wants to do. And I don't see that from a cartel. I see that as a money-making organization, point blank, period. Yes, I'm sure that they do some corporate social responsibility and give out like food to the poor and things like that. Great. This is orders of magnitude different. This is We'll provide schooling and medical. It's crappy, okay? It's not very good. It's not very good schooling. It's not very good medical care. They could do a lot better. I personally think that the drug lords who are resident in Wa should shower more of their money on everyday people. Okay, that would be great. I also would like Jeff Bezos to shower some more money on poor Americans too, right? But it's not how it doesn't play out like that.
That would be nice. Okay, now you have to get said everything about this because so you can save some of this stuff for your book so people are motivated to read it. But give us a little flavor of your adventure into Wa State, kind of going into this place. I mean, you're saying it's harder than North Korea or Taliban ruled Afghanistan to get into. So tell me a little about what about the story of going in there and meeting people in the Wa State.
My access was really on two fronts. So when you talk about actually putting foot on the other side of that border in Wa controlled territory, that was something I worked on a really, really long time. And I would I would hire guides that I knew who were local to the area, and I would go in and first I'm just seeing a Wa fortress in the distance. And at another point, I'm with another non-state armed group, revolutionary group, and I'm where their territory looks over at Wa State, and I'm seeing Wa soldiers on a mountain. Of course, I wanted something more than that. Eventually, what I was able to do is, with the help of some very courageous guides, go in across the border and go into a village that was under Wa domination. And the reason we were able to go into this village without any trouble, because remember, you're not supposed to go into Wa State unless they invite you, okay? And I went in uninvited. But this was an area where they had pushed a lot of people who were indigenous to that area, Shan people, into sort of a kind of a ghetto, really, like an open air ghetto on a mountain. And they were being watched by, well, Wa forces from a mountaintop above. But these people were willing to let me in and tell their story because they felt like they had been kicked around by the Wa. So with nation building, which is what the Wa have done in the last 35 years, often comes ethnic cleansing. So you have had some of that where Wa people come into an area and push a weaker indigenous group out. And so I talked to those people, and you can read about in the book. I'll just say, like, I wasn't exactly able to spend a month there. Okay. It was a precarious situation. Really, that was cool and everything. I mean, what I found to be much more revealing, my real journalistic coup was forming a relationship with this man who had been number 3 in the Wa organization for many years. And I was able to meet him, spent a lot of time with him, and he really, really opened up to me. I mean, he felt like he wanted to tell the inside story of how Wa State was formed. He also wanted people to understand that Wa people shouldn't just be cast off as headhunters and drug traffickers. I mean, this is a really beautiful civilization, in my opinion. I've met some Wa people that are fantastic, really brave, some extremely kind. I would consider this guy one of them. And yeah, he opened up everything for me. I mean, it would be like having, number 3 in the Chapo organization just say, "What do you want to know?" That in many ways, the book follows the course of his life, and we look at this drug trafficking organization through his eyes. And when I really knew Ioan that I was going to write a book is when he said, by the way, I was a DEA asset while I was with the Wa organization. And, you got to check everything out, right? Okay, give me some names. Who are your DEA handlers? He gave me some names. I tracked those people down, and I said, is this guy legit? And they said, oh, yeah. He was one of our best assets ever. They gave him the code name Superstar because he was giving them such good intel from within this organization. So that was my real, breakthrough right there.
So what was his motivation, do you think, for betraying? I mean, if it was he like working with the DEA, what was his whole game? and how did he play that off, with his own project for his people, and working with the enemy, or was he using that to hurt their own enemies, or what was his whole play, do you think?
As one of the former DEA agents told me, he's never met a CI, never met a confidential informant like this guy. He's like, usually they want money, they want to steer you towards their rivals. Some are just sort of like adrenaline junkies. This guy was an idealist, and he had this extreme faith in the mythology of America. I mean, all the stuff that I would roll my eyes at, he believed. Shining city on the hill type stuff. He thought that if his, largely vilified race, as he would put it, could unite with the greatest superpower on earth, America, this Christian nation that believes in like upholding, building up and rescuing the meek of the earth, really bought into all this stuff, that would change the course of his people's destiny, I suppose. And originally, he was telling the other WA leaders, I'm talking to the DEA, I've got a crazy idea. Let's let the Americans come in here and burn down all of our heroin labs and torch all of our poppies. And in exchange, they'll give us modernization, schools, hospitals, clinics, all these things that poor WA people really needed. And originally, the leaders were like, proceed, let's see what happens. And it actually came much closer to happening than you would ever imagine. But then the CIA got in the way. I'll leave people to buy the book if they want to know that story, because it's too long to repeat here. So when that fails, this guy is disgraced. He's still kicking around, but he could not give up this idea that America could really do something for his people, his benighted people. And he continued talking to the DEA more as a classic CI, a guy who was not supposed to be talking to the enemy. Mm-hmm. And it didn't work out so great. I'll just leave it at that for him.
So the CIA, I mean, without giving too much away about this conflict there, we go back to the CIA in this region. So the CIA in the 1950s are backing the anti-communist army in the Shan states to try and fight. And at that point, they're still believing they could dislodge the communist government in China. And then they get into the war in Vietnam, and so the CIA using various groups there to fight the North Vietnamese. They lose that as well. Afterwards, we get to the 80s, 90s. What do the CIA start to do? And are they still playing some games with some of these groups now, do you think? Or have they just changed their modus operandi and motivations now?
I don't have any evidence that the CIA currently has any involvement with drug trafficking groups in Southeast Asia. Actually, it would surprise me if they did, other than gathering intelligence. I mean, that's their job. If they had moles in these organizations to understand how much drugs they're producing and what political agendas they're furthering, yeah, that's actually just standard intelligence gathering, not propping anyone up. In the 90s, WA State was really coming into its own, and the CIA, the Cold War is over. Okay, so the WA don't have any use as far as fighting communism per se. Also, at this point, the WA were already firmly entrenching their relationship with China, because they're right on the border with China. And so I don't think there was any opportunity for the CIA to go in and flip them against China. I just don't frankly think the CIA folks in the region were competent enough to pull something like that off. So what was their agenda? The CIA really despised Burma's military regime and made a real priority of making sure that they were a villain on the world stage. Russia has collapsed at this point. I think America is looking for bad guys. There's a famous quote from Colin Powell, who was, I think, chief of the army at the time. He's like, I'm running out of bad guys. I'm down to like Kim Il-sung in North Korea and Castro, It was meant to be a funny quip, but there's something there. Burma's military regime was being built up as a bad guy. And guess what? They were really effing bad. I mean, they were genuinely horrible, very abusive. They were just slaughtering pro-democracy folks in the streets. I mean, it was really, really horrible. I mean, if you're looking for a bad guy, you've got one. And the CIA's agenda was to push back against this, to wave the human rights and democracy banner over Burma, and hopefully install or help to put into a position of power a woman named Aung San Suu Kyi, who was pro-American, pro-democracy, and all these things. And it's who the Burmese people wanted.
Okay, two more questions. And this is great stuff. First, so when some people hear this, China's funding a narco client state, and a lot of people, some people are going to be like, "Bang! I knew it all along." China's, reverse opium war. They're killing Americans with fentanyl. It's deliberate. I don't know if you know anything about the inside of China, but is this that kind of activity? If they're working with a client narco state, does make you think, okay, how do these Chinese behave? What do you think about that? And also, there's other people complaining, like I don't know, Philippines or Thailand complaining, like this you guys working with the Chinese are selling us, are selling all this crystal meth to us, because some of these Asian countries can have quite hard line anti-drug feelings and anti-drug policies.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I sometimes wonder if I'm going to wake up and see some, U.S. senator holding up my book and being like, see, I knew it the whole time. They're backing the world's most badass narco state. That would be an extremely simplistic read of events. Of course they are, for all the reasons that I mentioned. If they didn't have a relationship with the narcotics producers and traffickers on the other side of the border in Burma, then they would risk having all of these narcotics flood into China, one of the largest markets on earth. I mean, can you imagine how much more meth and more ketamine and whatever would be produced in Burma if they could really tap into that Chinese market? The Chinese authorities, just like the American authorities, don't want people doing drugs. This is something that every government tries to stop. And so by having a relationship with this narco state, they can limit the amount of drugs, at least coming from this, semi-lawless part of the world into their country. I think it's a pretty rational strategy. I don't think that there's some sort of nefarious undercurrent where like, oh, we'll let meth proliferate and harm these other countries. No, I'm sure they find it embarrassing. And I'm sure they'd rather not talk about it. It's sort of an ugly, ugly compromise. Probably the attitude is, well, I wish that this narco state wasn't there and that they didn't produce drugs at all. However, they're useful to us, and these drugs have to go somewhere, better Thailand than us, better the Philippines than us. I kind of see that as a calculation that any political party would make in any country. So as for whether or not China could limit the amount of fentanyl coming to the U.S., I don't have deep insight into what's happening in China. I mean, I cover the Golden Triangle. Intuitively, it does feel like with the surveillance state that China has, that if they made a priority of preventing certain chemicals from going to Mexico and being turned into fentanyl and going to the US, that they could do more, of course. But look, the United States has a massive security state, and it can't stop the drug epidemic in the US. So these big countries, as powerful as they are, have never really managed to like put a lid on drugs, right? So it's just a big mess. I think China is acting rationally. I don't think they deserve the Nobel Peace Prize for backing Wa State, but it makes sense if you look at their priorities.
Okay, last question. I was just my last episode before this was about the Taliban in Afghanistan and their effective, from what we understand, ban on opium. I mean, that they've knocked out 90% of the opium trade, from being the biggest opium heroin producer in the world, has been smashed, and that some of it's coming back to the Golden Triangle. So have you heard that as well? Is that true? And what does that say? Are we going to get like Golden Triangle 2.0 now? And might that include fentanyl as well? With that being developed, or what are your thoughts about the future, in this area? And is that happening already? And how does WA State play into this?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, I would say people don't need to be too worried about that. Heroin is passé in Southeast Asia, not just because the consumer demand is quite low, but also because it's an absolute pain in the ass to make heroin. You have to plant poppies outside in an area that's subject to the weather. So a bad winter can screw up your crops. You have to have legions of peasants out there scoring the opium poppy and planting them and tending to them. And you produce this brown goop opium, and then you have to take it to the lab, and then you have to turn it into heroin. It's a complete, it's so inefficient. The future of narcotics is synthetic, as we've seen with fentanyl in the United States. The future of narcotics here in Southeast Asia, the present and future, is methamphetamine. You can bring in chemicals all day long, and you can churn out so much meth that you don't even care if the police catch. I don't think they would care if they caught 20% of it, because they're making so much. You make it inside of a laboratory, make it inside of a building that just looks like any old barn or factory on Google Maps. The DEA, the CIA, whoever can't spy on what you're doing from satellites. If you're producing heroin and you have fields and fields and fields of poppies, well, I've talked to the DEA and CIA people who told me exactly what they would do. They would look at how many hectares of poppy were being planted, and then they would use these formulas to decipher how much heroin that could produce. So now you have an antagonistic entity, superpower, aware of your product yield. You don't want that. You don't want that. So I don't think the Southeast Asia will ever go back in that direction. Are you seeing more heroin comparatively come out of Southeast Asia than, say, the past few years? You've seen an uptick. A lot of that has to do with the fact that there is a raging revolutionary war in Myanmar. People are impoverished. A lot of folks that normally wouldn't want to be farming poppies are going back to it. And so you're seeing a little bit more, but just heroin is yesterday's story here in Southeast Asia. I'm not too worried about it. I fear, not the WA, but any group in Myanmar turning towards fentanyl, because then you would start to see some of the really ugly scenes you see in American downtowns happening here. I'm sure a lot of Americans think that Bangkok is maybe not the cleanest city. Okay, fine. I go down in Bangkok, right up the street here, and walk down the street. I do not see the type of, people nodding out on the street that you can see in LA and New York and Philly and wherever. It's not happening here. I don't even see too many people methed out. Meth doesn't create this very public display of addiction that fentanyl does. So that would be my fear. But so far, they're not producing fentanyl. So,
well, on that terrifying note, because yeah, I mean, I worry seeing the fentanyl revolution, and I think it's a revolution in the drug game this last few years, and the level of death in the United States, and the level of addiction, and talking to some of the addicts
yes.
on it who are just so strung out. I mean, zombies is kind of sad to say this, but they're kind of zombied out, these people, and what that could mean. And so I'm worried it's it's going to become. But Leslie, what a fascinating story. So yep, check out the book, link below. Check out Patrick's work, and yeah, always great to see here everybody in the Chronicles.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Outro, boom.